ever wanted to experience the thrill of the wind rushing through your hair as you drive an open-top sports car at Cannonball Run type speeds? Well, I don't know if this game can provide the thrill of the wind rushing through your hair. The deluxe arcade cabinet was advanced and had a lot of features, but I'm pretty sure it did not have a fan to simulate the wind. But what it did have was one of the best racing game experiences ever in an arcade in the 1980s. Outrun is a 3D driving video game in which the player controls a Ferrari Testarossa convertible from a third-person rear perspective. The road curves, crests and dips, which increases the challenge by obscuring upcoming obstacles such as traffic that the player must avoid. The object of the game is to reach the finish line against a timer. The game is divided into multiple stages that each end in a checkpoint, and reaching the end of a stage provides more time. Near the end of each stage, the track forks to give the player a choice of routes, leading to 5 final destinations. The destinations represent different difficulty levels and each conclude with their own ending scene. Among them, the Ferrari breaking down or being presented a trophy. Outrun, along with Hang On, was one of those Sega sprite scaler games that immediately drew you in to have a shot once you've seen it in an arcade. Whether it was a deluxe arcade cabinet or the more common upright cabinet, the immense speed of the visuals were enough to convince most gamers to give it a punt. To say this is merely Hang On but with a Ferrari would be a massive disservice. You see, Outrun in the arcades is a far better game than Hang On, more thrilling than Enduro Racer, and one of Sega's all-time great arcade games that still has a massive fan base to this day. As soon as you pop a credit in, you get the option of 3 music tracks: Magical Sound Shower, Passing Breeze, or my favourite, Splash Wave. From there, the action starts and the player is treated to some of the most impressive visuals ever to be seen in an arcade game from the 1980s. The sheer speed of the visuals is truly staggering. The sprite scaling effect used in Hang On has been improved in this game. with plenty of different non-licensed vehicles dotted across the roads, all scaling in superbly to emphasise the feeling of speed. And then the roadside objects, which change on every stage, add to this speed, especially in this section here, with the stone bridges stretching across the road and the change in incline to the downhill section, making everything seem even faster than before. The player-controlled Ferrari Testarossa looks sublime, and this sprite has certainly become something of an icon in the world of video gaming. Whenever references are made to sprite-based games of the 8 and 16-bit video game era, this car always appears, and for many, and I include myself here, the real sense of nostalgia is massive when seeing or playing this game. The sound is also much improved over Hang-On, with the engine sound still sounding like a hum, but the other sounds of the whizzing cars and the tyres screeching adding in some well-placed atmosphere to the already heightened sense of danger that comes with travelling at speeds of about 180 miles an hour. And with that danger comes the risk of crashing, which is something I do a lot on this game. But not every crash results in a wipeout. Some small nudges merely slow the player down a little, while others result in a complete spin out or the car barrel rolling off to the side. But the sound effects of the barrel roll are excellent in my opinion. The other excellent thing about the sound is the soundtrack, obviously. These tunes are definitely some of the most iconic tunes to ever be heard in a video game. Each tune sounds different, but all of them are of such a racy tempo that it all adds to the enjoyable playing experience of the game, and this is still a great game to play. Outrun falls into that category of elite game status, in my humble opinion. You see, there are not many gamers out there, old or young, who do not like Outrun, or appreciate what an influence the game had on the evolution of video games. The gameplay may seem really simple now, as all you do is drive fast, right, and try not to crash. So when compared to Gran Turismo or Project Gotham Racing or more modern racers, where the tracks are based on real life settings, and the car can be customised to improve performance by adding in huge turbos or stiffer suspension, then where does the challenge come from in Outrun? And that is a good question. But that is a wrong question to ask, in my opinion. The real question is this: would Gran Turismo have had such an amazing selection of music had it not been for Outrun? Would racing games even still have been a thing if Outrun had been a failure? Who knows? But in reality, to answer to those questions is probably yes. Bad racing games existed before Outrun, and plenty have appeared after Outrun as well. But for me, Outrun was one of my endearing memories of childhood. Any time I seen an Outrun arcade cabinet, I would have a go. It feels odd now, but playing it at the time made me feel grown up, as if I was an adult actually driving a car. And this was all based on the steering wheel control of the arcade machine. I was never any good at the game. I could quite often get to the second stage, but not much further than that. And when I was on a week's excursion with my high school in 1989, the ferry from Newcastle in England to Esbjerg in Denmark had this arcade cabinet. and my mate played this game religiously on the crossing. It was a 23-hour crossing, so he had plenty of time to play it, and on the way back too. His objective was to get his name on the scoreboard for each track, which was a bit pointless, as the machine was turned off so the cleaners could vacuum the carpet once the ferry made port at Denmark. The thing is, I had played Outrun a few years before that, and so I already had it for my Commodore 64, which my mate would often play at my house. And his first experience of Outrun was on the Commodore 64. And so I cannot imagine his reaction when seeing it in the arcades that time. And I do not ever remember asking him what he thought of the arcade version. But as I played it in the arcades before playing it on the Commodore 64, I remember my reaction to that all too well. Immediately, I have to say this game came with a warning that it was not very good. It wasn't like a public service announcement or anything, it was a more covert warning. You see, this game came with 2 cassettes. One was the game, and the other was the arcade soundtrack. The fact that the arcade soundtrack was thrown in for 3 was almost like an apology of sorts. Outrun on a Commodore 64 was not the best conversion. In Europe, we gamers got the US Gold version, but in the States there was another version, programmed by the same team, but released by Mindscape, which was slightly better, but not massively so. This one here is the US Gold Euro version, and I knew from experience of previous arcade ports that the Commodore 64 was done as an entity for decent arcade ports by 1988. But I was expecting something a little better than this. And this is not a knock on the developers, it's just that the arcade had progressed in terms of technology, and home micros just stand still. For a start, racing games on home micros need raster bars on the screen to help with the sense of speed, and on stage 1 they are there, from one side of the screen to the other. But in other levels they are nowhere to be seen, and this makes it seem like the car is just sliding about rather than driving. But it's not all doom and gloom. The SID chip done a pretty decent job of recreating the soundtracks. It's not perfect, but the tunes are recognisable at least. The other sound effects are pretty bland, to be honest. In terms of gameplay though, the game fails to capture the excitement and thrill of the arcade original. It also doesn't present the driver with the choice of routes, which is completely unforgivable in my opinion. The route split was one of the defining features of the game, and to not have it included would be like having steak and ale pie without the steak, or the ale. A real letdown. After the Denmark trip, and as my mate loved the arcade version of Outrun so much, I decided to see if I could snap up a copy of Outrun on the Master System. I knew it wouldn't be like the arcades, but it had to be better than the Commodore 64 version surely. Outrun was a 2 mega cartridge, which basically meant it was a 2 megabit game, and those normally retailed for about £30, which was about £20 more than I could usually afford at that time. But I knew of someone who had a copy of it. The problem was, this guy was, well, a bit of a dick, and a local bully. But that was years ago, and I was willing to take the risk that the guy had mellowed out, which he had, but I think that might have been as he'd just finished smoking a joint. Anyway, I gave him a loan of R-Type and I got Outrun, and then took my Master System and Outrun round to my mates in the summer of 1989. And to begin with, Outrun has smaller sprites, fewer cars, and less accurate controls of course. But what it did have was great gameplay, and lots of it. It's not the same as the arcade, obviously, but it was still great fun to play. The visuals were lacking and the sound was average, but none of that really mattered as we get a real blast playing it. It was probably made even more enjoyable as we got to play on his parents' TV in the living room, a whopping 21-inch CRT. His parents both worked, and so the summer holidays he was left under the supervision of a neighbour who was fairly easygoing and just popped in occasionally to make sure he wasn't burning down the house or anything, but that's a whole other story. Outrun was a game that was converted to just about every home format in the 80s, and none of them would really be that good. The Amiga and Atari ST looked good in screenshots, but looked terrible and slow when moving. The 48K Spectrum version looked quite good in stills also, but slow and choppy when moving. It would appear that Outrun was a game that was just too difficult to port to the home formats. Would a decent version ever come out for the home? A full 5 years after the arcade release of Outrun, Sega released it for the Megadrive, and I was hopeful of it being a fairly good representation of the arcade machine. It was now a game that was pretty old after all. Unfortunately, what I experienced with the Megadrive version was this sad effort. The visuals are not too bad, and a step up from the previous home releases, but something seems a little odd with them. It's like the colouring is not quite right or something. Pretty much everything has this shiny glossy look to it, and not the hard matte finish of the arcade. Now, I know the sprite scaling was not going to be possible on the Megadrive version. This was evidenced by other games, such as Space Harrier 2 and Afterburner 2. But to be honest, the effect they used isn't that bad when you can actually see it. There are so few cars on the road in this game, you begin to feel like the Amiga man. The heads up display looks awful as well. It's really hard to explain, but it looks basic. And the stage number and map are in the completely wrong place as well. The sound is the only saving grace here, as the tunes are faithfully recreated and sound pretty good in my opinion, but overall, presentation wise, this game is a real letdown. In terms of playability, I am not sure how Sega were able to pull this off, but they actually made Outrun boring to play. Seriously, it's so weird. But this version is just so bland in every aspect. So Outrun's reputation for being a tough game to port remains intact for now. A whole 10 years after the release of Outrun in the arcades, Sega released it as part of the Sega Ages on the Saturn, and oh my word, finally a decent home port of the arcade game. Sega could have probably just emulated this game on the Saturn in all honesty, but they didn't. They ported it, and I have to say this version of Outrun is absolutely superb in every way. For a start, the player has the option to change up the iconic background music from the original to an updated arranged version, which sounds excellent, but I still prefer the original for nostalgia reasons. The visuals are spot on to the arcade really. There are some subtle differences. Overall, this is spot on to the arcade, and it runs at a silky smooth 60 frames per second as well. The sound, as I have already mentioned, is great. Being a CD-ROM based game, poor sound effects and bad music were a thing that was consigned to the cartridge era, but everything here is just so similar to the arcade, and it sounds amazing. The gameplay is outstanding as well, although at times I did feel it was a little bit slower than the arcade original, but that's probably just me. The Saturn version of Outrun has long been my favourite of the game to play. In fact, I play this version more than I play the arcade version on emulation. It really is that good. It's also so hard to believe at the time this game came out, it was 10 years old. I was now 20 by this point, and then it hit me like a brick. I had been playing this in the arcade 10 years before, and had been playing video games since 1982. 14 years of video games. Over half my life spent in arcades and playing games. Where does the time go? But it's the memories I appreciate more. And while I did do other fun things in my life, video games are dated. And they act like an anchor for me. A sort of gravity pulling planet that draws in other memories of what I was doing at the time, who I was mates with, fashions of the time, taste in music and all that stuff. It's such a weird thing, but this is what my memories of video games do to my mind. Outrun would go on to become one of Sega's biggest hits. One of the biggest arcade games of all time. One of the true icons of video games. And even create a style of music influenced by it and named after it. And for me, it provides some of the happiest memories of my life. From a more carefree time in life, and I am always left with a smile on my face when I play Outrun, or hear its iconic tunes. Anyway, that was my look back at Outrun. If you like this video, then please do give me a sub and a thumbs up, or maybe even a comment or two below about your memories of Outrun on any format. That's all from me folks, thanks for watching.